Metal Jesus, I'm back again. Now, a while ago, I created a video called Atari 2600 Games That Don't Suck, and it was really popular, actually. A lot of people really enjoyed it. But, you know, honestly, for me, it was just an excuse to play through a bunch of games I grew up with as a kid. However, it is really nice to know when you're standing at, like, say, a garage sale, to know which games are worth it. I mean, is Asteroids on the Atari any good? Actually, it is. So I thought I would make another one of these videos to help people who are like me, and maybe you just want to know which ones are worth collecting. So here's another batch. Let's take a look. The first game I want to show you is a bit of a hidden gem called Frostbite by Activision. In this game, you play as an Eskimo who is trying to build an igloo before the temperature can get down to 0. Now, the way you do that is a bit of a mix of, let's say, Frogger and Q*bert. Essentially, there is this river and there's ice floating down it. And you control your Eskimo, and every time that he jumps on a piece of ice, it changes color and adds a brick to the igloo up in the upper hand right. Now, don't let the cutesy look of this game fool you. This is actually a pretty tricky puzzle game. And essentially what happens here is that there's all these animals that you can either collect for points, or they will try to push you off into the water and make you freeze to death. Now, if you find yourself getting in a bit of trouble, you can push the button on the joystick and use one of the bricks on your igloo, which sets you back a bit, but it allows you to change the direction of the water. It's very handy if you're going to be shoved off by one of the animals. This game can be pretty challenging, but surprisingly fun to play. I definitely recommend owning it. Next up is a bit of a classic that a lot of people love and played back in the day, and that is called Yars Revenge. Now, this game looks like no other, and believe it or not, it actually has a bit of a backstory. When you buy this game new, it actually comes with a comic book with all of this stuff inside. It's actually pretty interesting how they made up this backstory for this game. All you really need to know is that you control the ship that is flying around on the screen there. That's me. And you're trying to take out I guess it's like a boss over on the right-hand side that is protected by the shield. Now, what you want to do is chip away that shield so that the boss is exposed. And then at that point, you can summon this cannon that appears over on the left-hand side, and it sort of follows you. And then you fire that cannon, which goes in your direction, so you have to very quickly get out of the way and hope it hits that boss over on the right-hand side. In the center of the screen is a neutral zone, and so you're somewhat protected in there. Another interesting tactic about this game is that you can loop around by going to the top, and so that can be a very useful tactic in this game. So even though it looks kind of bizarre, and in many ways it is bizarre, there's no other game like it on the Atari that I'm aware of, but it's certainly a classic and very memorable. This next game is a definition of a hidden gem, and one that a lot of people love to have in their collection. It's called Turmoil. This is actually a really cool shooter for the Atari. Now, the layout of this game is actually kind of interesting. Essentially, your ship or your gun, whatever it is, can only really move up and down the center alley and blast away these aliens. And there's about 5 different aliens in this game, and each one of them with their own strategy. Now, what I mean by that is that some of them can only be destroyed from the front, or occasionally you'll see these arrows that, if allowed to travel across the screen, will turn into these tanks that are pretty tough. Now, the one time that you can go horizontal is when a prize appears. Now, a prize is worth a bunch of points, but the trick here is that you need to snag it really quickly, or it will actually turn into something that you need to avoid. It'll turn into this really fast-moving cannonball. Now, as this game goes on, it actually gets pretty crazy. The aliens get faster, gets very frantic, and even the layout will change. It'll go solid black on you, and you won't be able to see the different alleyways. So this is actually a really fun, fast-paced shooter. Probably one of the best on the Atari. I remember the first time I played Joust in the arcades as a kid, and I was kind of blown away by the physics. The way that the ostrich wings flapped and how it felt like you really were flying. And I was just kind of amazed that they were able to get fairly close to it on the Atari 2600. Now obviously this game is not as detailed or as beautiful as the arcade version, but it really feels like the core elements of the game are here. I mean, this game feels like Joust, and it's kind of amazing how they were able to program this on this simple home console. Another element of this version that I actually like quite a bit is that I find it to be a little bit easier than the arcade version. So I don't struggle with this quite as much. I can actually get fairly far into the game, which is really neat. However, there is one part of this game that is incredibly annoying, and that is the sound. If you can get past the sound, I think this is worth adding to your collection. Pengo is another arcade conversion for the Atari that is surprisingly fun to play. In this game, you play as a penguin, and you have 2 minutes to try to eliminate the snow bees. Now, the way you do that is by pushing blocks of ice into them, so you're constantly sliding blocks of ice into other characters. And it's actually kind of like it's almost like an arcade puzzle game. As rounds progress in this game, some blocks of ice have eggs in them that will hatch new snow bees as it goes along. Also, the game will award you additional points for doing combos. So for instance, if you take out multiple enemies with one piece of ice. Overall, Pengo is a surprisingly fun game, and it can be kind of hard to find out in the wild. So if you run across it at a garage sale, I highly recommend it. Ah yes, Enduro. If you had an Atari as a kid and you love racing games, Enduro was one of the best out there. So this game plays pretty similar to Pole Position, but Activision expanded on the gameplay quite a bit. Essentially, you're supposed to try to pass a certain number of cars within a 24-hour period. And you travel through all sorts of different environments, including sunshine, and then it moves into fog, it'll go into night, and snow. It seems pretty simple today, and when you play it today, it can be maybe disappointing, but man, back in the day, it was awesome. One of the things I really liked about this game is that you can't really crash. Instead, if you hit another car, it just stops you. And all these cars that you just passed will keep right on going, and so you basically lose ground. Now, there are several times when I play this game, especially once you get past the first day and you have to pass more cars, that you will barely make it in this game. It's actually pretty white-knuckled. It's definitely a lot of fun. Now, here's an unusual game that I'm going to include in this list, but not everybody's crazy about it, and that's because it's kind of weird, but it's called Private Eye by Activision. Many people have described this game as a driving adventure game. Now, what I mean by that is that you control this guy cruising around in this Model A car who is trying to collect these items and return them back to the place where they belong. And there's thieves that you'll see, but what makes this game really bizarre is that you control the car and you can essentially make it jump, and it bumps your guy out who can then reach higher levels and grab things. It's definitely a weird concept and it takes some getting used to, but actually the graphics are pretty good for the Atari, and it has a really interesting map on here. You actually have to pay attention to locations. As a matter of fact, the manual comes with a really useful map that you kind of need to look at to plan your adventure. Now, there are a lot of screens in this game, and most of them look very similar, so it's pretty easy to get lost, so you need to hold on to that map. And also, it appears that the game is kind of randomized, but I don't know, I like it. It's definitely got some charm. Galaxian was a pretty big arcade hit, and surprisingly the Atari 2600 version's pretty decent. This shooter takes the Space Invaders formula and mixes it up a bit. It's more colorful, obviously, but also I really like the fact that the aliens dive bomb towards you, which adds an element of, I don't know, stress to the whole game. Now, if you're into these kind of shooters, definitely check out Phoenix and also Demon Attack on the Atari. Those are fantastic as well. Now, here's a bit of an odd game, and I say that because it's actually based on a movie from the 60s called Fantastic Voyage. The premise of this game is that you are piloting a miniature sub that has been injected into an ill patient's bloodstream. Now, your goal here is to blast obstacles that are hurting that patient. In the bloodstream, there are the things you would expect, like blood clots and enzymes. Some of these you shoot to release their healing properties, and others you need to avoid. There is also this constant heart meter that tells you just exactly how healthy your patient is and if they're dying. This game is surprisingly well made for a movie licensed game and pretty much a must own for any shooter fan on the Atari. Beany Bopper is a game that I recently picked up at a garage sale, just kind of on a whim, and despite the really dumb name, this is actually kind of fun. So in this weird and kind of wacky game, you play this purple eyeball that cruises around and tries to stun and then pick up these Beany Boppers. So essentially this is a shooter, although there is a bit of strategy involved in this game. For instance, if you just hold down the fire button, well, you'll shoot more rapidly, but you have to get so much closer because there's not that much range to it. But if you plan your shot, you can actually be way further back, therefore safer. Also, as the game progresses, man, the enemies get way tougher. They actually get way more aggressive, way faster. So, I don't know, this game's kind of fun. It's not mind-blowing, but yeah, it doesn't suck. So that's a quick look at some of the 2600 games that don't suck. Hopefully you found that useful. And I would love to know what you think. Post below, let me know some titles that maybe I need to be aware of and, be on the lookout for. As always, I want to thank you for watching my channel and thanks for subscribing. Take care.